Ever since Cataclysm, the size of World of Warcraft's player base has been shrinking. And ever since Cataclysm, it seems like Blizzard has been asking themselves the question, what can we do to get players to keep logging in? Solutions have been tried, huge amounts of dailies and a long progression in mists, garrisons and warlords. Neither one of them worked. In fact, the consensus of the player community is that both were counterproductive. I think there's another relevant question to ask. What was it that kept players logging in before Cataclysm rolled around? And I think I know what the answer is, but I'm going to need to go into a little history. Now, I created the WoW Then and Now series a year or two ago, so this is still fresh in my mind. If you haven't watched it, Blizzard, I'd strongly suggest you give it a look, since it shows what a World of Warcraft's history is and what its ups and downs have been. But as a casual player who's been in the game since the summer of 2005, I have to say that the single biggest change to the game since it was launched was actually the addition of the Looking for Group auto-matchmaking system. This happened around the end of Wrath of the Lich King, and I think it is the single biggest change that altered PvE gameplay in the game's entire history. Before Looking for Group matchmaking, you had to stay in a capital city, and you had to spam the Looking for Group chat channel. It was basically another version of trade chat back then, and you had to figure on spamming it for an hour or so before you got a group that could enter a dungeon and take on bosses. After the Looking for Group matchmaking system was added, all you had to do was queue up and wait, and then you were in a dungeon. You didn't even need to go to a portal to enter the dungeon. It was that convenient. Now, in my WoW Then and Now series, I praised this convenience and thought it was one of the things that made Wrath of the Lich King such a great expansion. But, as convenient as it was, there was a side effect to Looking for Group auto matchmaking that you may not have noticed. I didn't notice it until very, very recently myself, but it's relevant to the game and it's relevant to why players aren't logging in. The Looking for Group auto matchmaking system made it much, much easier for players to play the game on their own. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, as soon as they're in a 5-man dungeon, aren't they with 4 other human beings? Well, yes, but those 4 other human beings could be from different servers, so it's not really social interaction at all, unlike what you'd get if they were all from the same guild. In Vanilla, the Burning Crusade, and most of Wrath, pretty much you had to be in a guild if you wanted so much as to get into a 5-man dungeon quickly and easily. If you had a guildmate or 3 who were usually logged in at about the same times as you were, who were interested in the same in-game content as you were, and had different specializations, that meant that you had to wait for fewer people to be willing to join you, and you could get into a dungeon much quicker. That you can't get it done on your own thing that the game had back before Cataclysm was the magnet that drew people together into guilds. And it was the people in those guilds that kept me logging in back in Vanilla, the Burning Crusade, and Wrath. It was the social interaction and the fun you could have with them that made me want to keep coming back to the game. Granted, the game had to have good content for me to join those other people in playing through in order for it to actually be a game, but the content itself wasn't what brought me back. It was the other people, their individual personalities, their spontaneity, the ability I had to bounce ideas off of them and talk with them and interact with them that made WoW the great game that it was back in the day. This may seem very strange to the artists, developers, and designers who built the world of Azeroth, but it wasn't so much what you guys built that made it a great game as it was the players you attracted and the social interaction that your world generated. But when Looking for Group auto matchmaking entered the game, it wasn't really necessary to be in a guild anymore to see the content. At this point, it was content that was expected to keep players logging in and to keep them engaged, but the problem with content was that you run out of it at some point. Continents get explored completely, leveling quests get completed, reputations get maxed out, and eventually there's nothing left but dailies, heroics, and looking for raid. And dailies, heroics, and looking for raid, no matter how diverse you make them, they eventually get old and boring. Content itself cannot keep players logging in. You're going to need to get players together again if you want players to keep logging in. So all in all, we're both being tricked, both players and developers. We've been in a double-blind scenario. Both developers and players are thinking, oh, there are dungeons, there's battlegrounds, there's raids, overworlds to explore, and that's what I'm going to enjoy if I buy this expansion. But really, the thing that we need to log in to enjoy if we're going to keep coming back to the game, even after the content gets old, is social interaction. You need to find a way to get players to come together and stay together if you want this to be a good expansion. Now, I don't know exactly what the right way is to do that, but I have a few ideas. They may or may not be the right answer. The main thing I'm trying to convey in this video is that the goal of making friends and getting social interaction is the goal Blizzard needs to set for Legion. How they reach that goal doesn't matter so much. In fact, pretty much the only reason I'm putting these ideas at the end of this video at all is to illustrate that goal. The first idea that popped into my head to elicit social interaction was to force players to look for a guild by adding a segment to the expansion-long quest chain that cannot be completed in looking for raid. You need to go into raiding per se in order to complete that quest chain. I'm assuming there's going to be a long quest chain in Legion, similar to the Legendary Ring quest chain in Warlords and the Legendary Cloak quest chain in Mists. If there is, then there's a segment of the quest chain that drives players into a guild and makes no secret of the fact that raiding per se takes multiple tries, preferably with Khadgar or someone like him repairing your guild for free, then that could get players to join guilds. But sometime after I got this idea, I realized that when I was in guilds in the Burning Crusade, the Wrath, and Vanilla, I leveled with those guilds, and going through the leveling process helped to establish guilds in my mind early on in the expansion, and it gave me a chance to get to know the people in those guilds. It was like, okay, that's how it's going to be in this game. I log on, I see these people, I interact with them, we go into dungeons and raids together, this is how the game's going to work. Okay, I can get used to this. We're going in a particular direction and we're all going there together. Nice. And if you wait until a player is at maximum level to get them into the social scene, it'll be like changing the deal partway through and forcing them to get used to a whole new modus operandi. So ideally, there'd be something that gets players into a guild right at the start of an expansion. Maybe adding a requirement to looking for for players at level 100 who are just starting the expansion out, they need to be in a group of 3 in order to queue up. That might help. Players at level 102 or something like that could join the queue without that requirement, but if you're level 100, you need a couple of guildmates. I don't know. The problem with social interaction is that it's not genuine if it's forced, but Blizzard needs social interaction to happen if they want the game to get turned around. It's a weird dilemma. Another idea I had, which I think is better, is world bosses that you can fight at level 100. Why only have world bosses at level 110? If there are level 100 world bosses, they should drop gear that gets you ahead in the leveling process and can get you into level 105 dungeons much sooner than you would otherwise get into them. But the level of coordination required to beat these level 100 world bosses should require a guild with a Ventrilo server. It should require trial and error and learning the fight, much like traditional raiding per se does. Having bosses like these would encourage players to get into guilds at the start of the expansion. If there's no space for these bosses, well, space can be made. A small, otherwise featureless island in the ocean, new floating rocks next to Dalaran, putting the boss in some underused zone in the Eastern Kingdoms or Kalimdor, or even Northrend or Outland would work. At this late stage in development, I think world bosses are still worth adding in. There's probably tons more ideas that could work, but honestly, what Blizzard needs in order to save World of Warcraft is encouraging guild membership, whether it's using these ideas or whatever. We need social interaction back in this game.